December 20th, 1922. The Colorado River was a churning, mud-thick artery of ice-cold water, carving through the prehistoric rock of the Black Canyon with a violence that few men dared to challenge. John Gregory Tierney, a middle-aged surveyor with a steady hand and a quiet disposition, stepped out onto a small barge. He was tasked with finding the perfect spot for what would eventually become the greatest engineering marvel of the 20th century. But the river didn't care about progress. A sudden surge, a momentary loss of footing, and John was gone. The current swallowed him whole, pulling him into the dark, silt-heavy depths. His body was never recovered. He was the first man to die for the Hoover Dam. Exactly 13 years later, on December 20th, 1935, a young man named Patrick Tierney fell from one of the massive intake towers on the Arizona side of the canyon. He plummeted into the water and perished instantly. Patrick was the final man to die during the project's construction. He was John Gregory Tierney's only son. The project began and ended with the blood of the same family, a grim, symmetrical sacrifice to a monument of concrete and ambition. 112 men died to build the Hoover Dam. How many lives is a miracle worth? And why did we decide that $3,000 a day was more valuable than the men who stood in the heat? To understand the tragedy of the Hoover Dam, you have to understand the monster they were trying to cage. In the early 1900s, the Colorado River was known as the Red Bull. It was unpredictable, temperamental, and lethal. Every spring, the snowmelt from the Rockies would transform the river into a wall of water that smashed through the Imperial Valley of California, drowning farms and wiping out entire towns. In the summer, the river would dry to a trickle, leaving those same farmers to watch their crops wither in the scorching sun. The American Southwest was a land of extremes that refused to be tamed, and the federal government decided that nature would no longer be allowed to dictate the terms of survival. They wanted to build a wall of concrete so massive it would hold back 2 years' worth of river flow. They wanted to create a reservoir so large it could drown the state of New York under a foot of water. They wanted to turn the desert into an empire of green fields and neon lights. The man who championed this vision was Herbert Hoover. Before he was the president who would be blamed for the Great Depression, he was the great engineer. Hoover saw the world through the lens of efficiency and resource management. To him, the Colorado River was a wasted asset. It was power and water that was simply flowing into the Gulf of California without being taxed, measured, or sold. Hoover spent years negotiating the Colorado River Compact, a legal battle between 7 states that fought over every gallon of water like vultures over a carcass. He needed a win. He needed a monument that would prove the American government could conquer the very earth itself. But Hoover was a politician, and politicians don't pour concrete. They don't hang from cables over 700-foot drops. They sign papers and leave the dying to someone else. That someone else was Frank Crowe. If Herbert Hoover was the architect of the dream, Frank Crowe was the high priest of the machine. They called him Hurry Up Crowe. He was a man possessed by a singular fanatical obsession: speed. To Crowe, a construction site was a battlefield, and the only metric of success was the schedule. He didn't just want to build the dam, he wanted to build it faster than anyone thought possible. He was an engineering genius who could look at a canyon wall and see exactly where every bolt and blast needed to go, but he looked at his workers the same way he looked at his shovels. They were tools. They were replaceable. They were a means to an end. Crowe knew that the desert heat and the dangerous terrain would kill men, but in his mind, that was just part of the overhead. By 1931, the project was ready to begin, but the scale of the task was so immense that no single company in America could handle it. This led to the formation of the 6 companies incorporated. It was a cartel of industrial giants, including the Bechtel Corporation and the Kaiser Group. These were men like Stephen Bechtel and Henry Kaiser, names that would go on to build the modern world on the backs of government contracts. They submitted a bid of $48,890,995. It was the largest contract ever awarded by the United States government at that time. But the contract came with a hidden price tag, a clause that functioned as a death warrant for the men on the ground. The federal government inserted a penalty clause into the deal. For every day the project ran past the completion date, the 6 companies would be fined $3,000. In the 1930s, $3,000 was a fortune. It was enough to pay the annual wages of 3 workers. To the men running the 6 companies, this wasn't just a deadline, it was a threat to their profit margins. They knew that safety was slow. They knew that taking the time to properly ventilate tunnels or secure safety lines would eat into their minutes, and minutes turned into hours, and hours turned into $3,000 fines. From the very first day, the priority was clear. The clock was more important than the pulse. The site they chose was the Black Canyon, a place that seemed designed by God to kill human beings. The walls of the canyon are sheer volcanic rock, rising nearly 1,000 feet from the river floor. In the summer, the temperature at the bottom of the canyon regularly hits 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The rock itself absorbs the sun's radiation and radiates it back, turning the canyon into a literal oven. There is no breeze, there is no shade, there is only the relentless, suffocating weight of the heat. To even begin construction, they had to move 6,600,000 tons of concrete. But before a single drop of concrete could be poured, they had to move the river. The plan was to drill 4 massive diversion tunnels through the canyon walls, each 50 feet in diameter. This was the most dangerous part of the entire project. Men were sent into the dark, cramped interiors of the rock to blast and dig. The air inside the tunnels was a toxic soup of dust, exhaust from the trucks, and the lingering fumes of dynamite. There was no ventilation. The workers' lungs were being shredded by silica dust and poisoned by carbon monoxide. When they collapsed from the heat or the fumes, the company doctors would often list the cause of death as pneumonia to avoid paying workers' compensation. They called it the Nevada fever, a convenient lie to cover up the fact that the project was suffocating its workforce. You have to imagine the scene in 1931. Thousands of men, desperate for work during the Great Depression, flooded into the Nevada desert. They brought their families and lived in ragtag tents and shacks made of cardboard and scrap metal in a place they called Ragtown. They were willing to do anything for $4 a day. They stood in lines for hours just for the chance to risk their lives in the canyon. Frank Crow and the 6 companies knew this. They knew that for every man who fell from a cliff or died of heat stroke, there were 100 more waiting at the gates, hungry and desperate. This power imbalance created a culture of silence and suffering. The logistics were a nightmare. Every piece of equipment, every pound of food, and every gallon of water had to be hauled into the desert. There were no roads. There was no infrastructure. There was only the heat and the rock. The workers were pushed to their absolute limits, working 24 hours a day in 3 relentless shifts. The roar of the machinery and the constant thunder of explosions meant that no one ever truly slept. The canyon became a world of its own. A high-stakes, high-speed industrial hellscape where the only thing that mattered was the next yard of rock moved, the next foot of tunnel drilled. As the first year of construction ground on, the promise of the dam began to look more and more like a threat. The vision of a tamed river and a powered-up Los Angeles was being built on a foundation of broken bones and scorched lungs. The architects in Washington and the executives in their air-conditioned offices spoke of progress and national pride. But down in the Black Canyon, the men were looking at the sheer walls and the rushing water, and they were starting to realize that they weren't just building a dam. They were building a tomb. The scale of the task was unprecedented, the ambition was staggering, and the cost was already becoming clear. The project was moving forward at a record pace, fueled by the $3,000 a day penalty and Frank Crow's relentless drive. But the river was still waiting, and the rock was still unforgiving. The bodies were already piling up. The heat in the Black Canyon did not just burn, it suffocated. It was a physical weight, a thick, searing blanket of 120 degrees that pressed against your lungs until every breath felt like inhaling liquid lead. In the summer of 1931, the canyon was not a construction site. It was a furnace. But for the thousands of men drifting across a broken, bankrupt America, that furnace looked like salvation. The Great Depression had turned the proudest men in the country into ghosts, haunting rail yards and bread lines, their pockets empty and their spirits crushed. When word spread that the 6 companies were hiring for the Boulder Canyon project, the exodus began. They came from the dust bowls of Oklahoma and the shuttered factories of the Rust Belt. They came in rusted Model TS and on foot, carrying everything they owned in cardboard suitcases. They weren't looking for glory or to build a monument to American ingenuity. They were looking for $4 a day, $4, to a man who had watched his children go to bed hungry for a year. That measly sum was worth any risk. Frank Crow knew this. The contractors knew this. They knew they didn't have to worry about safety regulations or labor complaints because there was a line of 5,000 desperate men waiting at the gates of Las Vegas to replace anyone who complained, anyone who slowed down, or anyone who died. This was the leverage of the desperate. The company used the national tragedy of the Depression as a tool to sharpen their profit margins. They didn't see human beings. They saw replaceable units of energy. And those units were about to be pushed to the absolute breaking point in a place the locals called the Hell Hole. Before the government built the manicured, air-conditioned streets of Boulder City, the workers and their families had to survive in a place called Ragtown. Officially known as Williamsville, it was a sprawling, wretched shantytown perched on the edge of the Colorado River. There were no trees for shade. There was no running water. There was no sanitation. Thousands of people lived in tents made of burlap sacks, scrap wood, and flattened cardboard boxes. The ground was sun-baked silt that turned into a choking powder with every step. Imagine being a mother in Ragtown, trying to keep a newborn baby cool when the temperature inside your tent hit 130 degrees by noon. Imagine trying to wash clothes in the chocolate-brown, silt-heavy water of the Colorado, knowing that the same water was likely carrying the typhoid that was already beginning to ripple through the camp. The men would return from a 12-hour shift in the tunnels, their clothes stiff with sweat and grime, only to collapse in a dirt floor shack where the air never moved. There was no ice. There was no relief. In the first few months, heat stroke was not an ailment. It was a plague. Men would be eating their meager dinner and simply slide off their benches, dead before they hit the dust. The company dismissed these deaths. They weren't industrial accidents in the eyes of the bookkeepers. They were natural causes. But there is nothing natural about a 30-year-old man's heart exploding because he was forced to work in a rock gallery that lacked even the most basic ventilation. Among the desperate, there was a hierarchy of danger, and at the top were the high scalers. These were the daredevils, the men who climbed the sheer, prehistoric walls of the canyon to strip away loose rock before the dam could be poured. They were the first thing you saw if you looked up from the canyon floor, tiny black specks swinging hundreds of feet in the air on thin hemp ropes. One of the most famous was Benny Williams. To the tourists who would eventually come to gawk, the high scalers looked like acrobats. To the men on the ropes, it was a daily dance with gravity where the floor was a jagged graveyard. The high scalers worked with heavy pneumatic jackhammers that weighed nearly as much as they did. They would kick off from the cliff face, swinging out over the abyss, and then use the momentum to slam back against the rock, jamming their drills into the face of the canyon. The vibration of the jackhammer would rattle their teeth and numb their hands, making it even harder to grip the rope that was the only thing standing between them and a 500-foot plunge. They didn't have safety harnesses in the way we understand them today. They sat on a simple wooden bosun's chair, held by a rope that was constantly being frayed by the sharp volcanic edges of the canyon walls. To protect themselves from falling rocks dislodged by workers above, the high scalers took their cloth hats and dipped them in coal tar, letting them bake in the sun until they were rock hard. These were the world's first hard hats, born of a desperate need to survive an environment where a pebble falling from the rim could strike with the force of a bullet. Benny Williams and his crew were paid slightly more for their bravery, but the cost was a constant state of hypervigilance. One slip of a knot, one momentary dizzy spell from the heat, and you were gone. The canyon floor was littered with the wreckage of men who had lost that gamble. But while the high scalers faced the open air, another group of men faced the suffocating darkness of the diversion tunnels. These 4 massive tubes, each 56 feet in diameter, had to be carved through the solid rock of the canyon walls to bypass the river. This was the kingdom of the muckers. Inside the tunnels, the heat was even worse than the desert sun. It was a humid, stagnant heat, trapped by the rock and intensified by the exhaust of the massive trucks and jumbo drilling rigs. In 1931, internal combustion engines were not the clean-burning machines of today. The tunnels were filled with a thick blue haze of carbon monoxide and diesel fumes. There was no mechanical ventilation system. The men breathed it in for 8, 10, 12 hours at a time. This is where we find the story of H.E. Boomer. He wasn't just a laborer, he was a tunnel superintendent, a man who lived and breathed the dust of the project alongside his crew. In the summer heat, Boomer collapsed. The official report said he died of heat prostration, but the men in the tunnels knew better. It was the fumes. It was the lack of air. Boomer was one of the first high-ranking casualties, a sign that the project's brutal pace would claim everyone from the bottom to the top. The company, however, had a legal strategy for these deaths. If a man died of pneumonia or heat stroke, the 6 companies didn't have to pay workers' compensation. They claimed the conditions were acts of God or the result of the workers' own poor health. They even went so far as to tell doctors to list carbon monoxide poisoning as pneumonia on death certificates. This wasn't just negligence. It was a coordinated effort to suppress the true cost of the dam. They were stealing the lives of these men and then stealing the dignity of their deaths to save a few $1,000s in insurance payouts. The industrial casualties were often violent and sudden. Isidore Zimmerman was a young man just trying to survive the Depression when he found himself working in the shadow of the massive mucker trucks. These were giant, lumbering beasts that moved rock out of the tunnels. In the chaos of the construction, with the roar of a dozen drills and the blinding dust, visibility was zero. Zimmerman never saw the truck that backed over him. He was pulverized under the massive tires, his life extinguished in a second of mechanical indifference. There was no moment of silence. There was no work stoppage. They shoveled up what was left of Isidore Zimmerman, hosed down the tires, and the next truck rolled in. The $3,000 a day penalty for being behind schedule meant that a human life was worth significantly less than 24 hours of progress. This disregard for life was compounded by a systemic, institutionalized racism that dictated who got the most dangerous jobs and who was allowed to live in comfort. The contract between the federal government and the 6 companies contained a chilling clause: no Mongolian labor shall be employed. This was a direct, racist strike against Chinese workers who had built the railroads of the West. But the prejudice didn't stop there. Out of a workforce of 5,000, only 30 black workers were hired. These 30 men were subjected to a level of cruelty that even their white counterparts didn't have to endure. While white workers eventually moved into the air-cooled barracks of Boulder City, the black workers were barred. They were forced to remain in the searing heat of the river camps or in segregated quarters that were little more than pens. They were given the most grueling, back-breaking jobs in the lowest parts of the canyon where the heat was most intense. They were the last to be hired and the first to be fired. When the temperature hit 120 degrees, white workers were sometimes given breaks or access to water barrels. Black workers were often told to keep shoveling or leave. They were building a monument to American progress that they weren't even allowed to live near. The daily toll of the Hoover Dam was a slow-motion massacre. We often hear the official death toll of 96 workers, but that number is a sanitized lie. It only counts those who died on the job site from direct accidents. It doesn't count the wives and children who died of heat exhaustion and dysentery in Ragtown. It doesn't count the hundreds of men who left the project with Hoover Dam fever, a euphemism for lungs destroyed by rock dust and carbon monoxide, only to die months later in a charity hospital. Some estimates suggest that over 150 families lost a breadwinner or a child to the construction of this dam. Every morning, the trucks would rumble out of Las Vegas and the camps, carrying men toward the canyon. They sat in the back, shoulder to shoulder, looking like soldiers being sent to the front lines. And in many ways they were. The enemy was the rock, the river, and the relentless ticking of the clock. They worked in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The lights of the project could be seen for miles, a glowing scar in the desert where the laws of nature were being rewritten by the sheer force of human sacrifice. You have to understand the psychological weight of this environment. You are working for a company that views you as an expendable resource. You are living in a tent where your children are constantly crying from the heat. You are watching your friends fall from cliffs or get crushed by machinery. And yet you cannot leave. There is nowhere else to go. The rest of the country is a graveyard of closed banks and empty farms. The Hoover Dam was a prison with no walls, where the only escape was through the completion of the project or a trip to the morgue. The workers began to push back, leading to a strike in August of 1931. They demanded better living conditions, the end of the pneumonia cover-ups, and a living wage that reflected the danger of the work. Frank Crow's response was cold and immediate. He didn't negotiate. He didn't listen. He simply fired everyone and told them to get out of the canyon. He knew that for every man who walked away, there were 10 more waiting at the gates of Las Vegas, starving and ready to take their place. The strike was crushed in days. The power of the 6 companies was absolute, backed by the federal government's desperate need for a political win during the darkest days of the Depression. As the summer of 1931 bled into 1932, the diversion tunnels were finally finished. The Colorado River, for the first time in millions of years, was forced out of its natural bed and into the concrete veins carved by the workers. It was a massive engineering victory, celebrated in newspapers across the globe. But the men who stood in the mud of the dry riverbed didn't feel like heroes. They felt like survivors. They looked at the empty tunnels and the rising concrete, and they didn't see a miracle of modern science. They saw a graveyard. They saw the spot where Isidore Zimmerman was crushed. They remembered the day H.E. Boomer collapsed. They thought of the nameless men who had been hauled away in the back of trucks, their deaths recorded as natural causes to protect the company's bottom line. The dam was rising, foot by agonizing foot. The concrete was being poured into massive wooden forms, generating its own chemical heat that added to the already unbearable temperatures of the canyon. To keep the dam from cracking, they had to run miles of cooling pipes through the concrete, circulating ice water to pull the heat out. It was a brilliant solution to a complex engineering problem, but there was no cooling system for the men. There was no ice water for the lungs of the muckers or the hearts of the high scalers. The project was moving at a record pace, fueled by the $3,000 a day penalty and Frank Crow's relentless drive. The death toll kept climbing, but the project didn't slow. The desert sun was a hammer, but the diversion tunnels were the anvil. To build a dam of this scale, you first have to move a river that has spent 6 million years carving through solid rock. Frank Crow's plan was as simple as it was terrifying. He would drill 4 massive tunnels through the canyon walls, 2 on the Nevada side, 2 on the Arizona side to bypass the construction site entirely. Each of these tunnels was 56 feet in diameter, the height of a 5-story building, and they stretched for nearly a mile through the volcanic heart of the earth. But as the muckers and drillers stepped into those holes, they weren't just entering a construction site. They were stepping into a pre-industrial hellscape where the laws of nature and the rules of safety simply ceased to exist. Inside the tunnels, the temperature didn't just rise, it mutated. The combination of the desert's external heat and the internal heat generated by the curring rock and heavy machinery pushed the mercury to a lethal 140 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a wet, heavy, suffocating heat that felt like a physical weight on the chest. Men would drink 2 gallons of water a shift and never once need to use the restroom. The moisture simply evaporated through their pores the moment it touched their skin. They worked in loincloths and boots, their bodies slick with a mixture of sweat and rock dust, looking more like ghosts than men. This wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a biological breaking point. When the human body hits 140 degrees, the organs begin to fail. Men would stagger out of the tunnels, their eyes rolling back in their heads, only to collapse in the slightly cooler 100-degree air outside. Some never stood up again, but the heat was only the silent killer. The loud ones were the jumbos, massive, 3-story drilling rigs mounted on truck chassis that carried 30 drills at a time. The noise was a physical assault, a jackhammering roar that vibrated the very marrow of a man's bones. And behind the jumbos came the trucks. To keep the project moving at the pace Frank Crow demanded to avoid those $3,000 a day penalties, the 6 companies didn't wait for the smoke to clear after a blast. They sent the trucks in immediately. Dozens of internal combustion engines roared 24 hours a day inside those unventilated stone pipes. The result was a thick, invisible cloud of carbon monoxide that settled into the lungs of every man on the line. There was no ventilation system. The 6 companies, led by men like Harry Morrison and Felix Kahn, decided that the cost of industrial fans was a luxury they couldn't afford if they wanted to stay ahead of the clock. Instead, they let the men breathe the exhaust. The workers began to drop. It started with a blinding headache, then nausea, then total physical collapse. In the summer of 1931, dozens of men were being carried out of the tunnels every single day. The official records from the company hospital didn't list carbon monoxide poisoning, though. That would have made the 6 companies liable for workers' compensation. Instead, the company doctors, paid for by the contractors, listed the cause of death as pneumonia. It was a cold-blooded lie. Pneumonia is a slow-acting respiratory infection. These men were healthy at the start of an 8-hour shift and dead by the end of it. By calling it pneumonia, the 6 companies categorized the deaths as natural causes, meaning they didn't have to pay a single cent to the widows or the children left behind. One worker, a young man named Edward Wentworth, told his wife he felt like his lungs were on fire every time a truck passed him in the tunnel. 2 days later, he collapsed. The company doctor barely looked at him before scribbling pneumonia on the chart. He was 24 years old. His death wasn't a tragedy to the bosses, it was a bookkeeping adjustment. The danger wasn't just in the air, it was hanging directly over their heads. The canyon walls were made of unstable, fractured rock. A single vibration from a drill or a distant blast could send a widowmaker, a jagged slab of stone the size of a dinner table, hurtling down from 100 feet above. In the early days, the men wore nothing but cloth baseball caps or felt hats. They would dip these hats in heavy coal tar and let them dry in the sun, creating a primitive, rock-hard shell. This was the birth of the American hard hat, but it wasn't born out of a desire for safety. It was born out of a desperate DIY attempt at survival. The 6 companies eventually saw the utility in it, but not for the reasons you'd think. They realized that if a man wore a hard hat, his skull might stay intact enough for the body to be identified quickly, which meant the shift wouldn't have to be delayed while they scraped brains off the canyon floor. Even with the tunnels finished and the river diverted, the engineering challenges only grew more monstrous. The sheer volume of concrete required for the dam 3,250,000 cubic yards presented a problem that had never been solved in human history. When concrete sets, a chemical reaction called heat of hydration occurs. It generates its own internal heat. If the Hoover Dam had been poured as a single, solid block, the internal temperature would have reached a staggering 150 degrees and stayed there for more than a century. The engineers calculated that without an artificial cooling system, it would have taken 125 years for the dam to fully set and cool. During that century of cooling, the concrete would have contracted and cracked so severely that the entire structure would have shattered under the weight of the reservoir. To prevent this catastrophe, the dam was built as a series of interlocking trapezoidal columns. But even then, the heat was too much. The solution was an intricate 582-mile labyrinth of 1-inch steel pipes embedded directly into the concrete as it was poured. They pumped ice-cold water from a massive refrigeration plant capable of producing 1,000 tons of ice a day through these pipes to suck the heat out of the living stone. It was a technical marvel, but for the men installing the pipes, it was a nightmare. They were working on narrow ledges, surrounded by thousands of tons of wet, burning concrete, tripping over miles of slick metal tubing while the desert sun beat down on them from above. If a man fell into the pour, he wasn't always pulled out. There are stories, whispered for decades, of men who became part of the dam's very foundation, though the official records vehemently deny it. But when you look at the pace Frank Crowe demanded, you realize that stopping a pour to recover a body was a delay that cost money. And at the Hoover Dam, money always had a higher valuation than a human life. The pressure to maintain that pace turned the canyon into a literal pressure cooker. The 6 companies had signed a contract with a $5 million performance bond. If they fell behind, the government would bleed them dry. Frank Crowe, the hurricane of the project, was a man obsessed with the calendar. He pushed the men through 12-hour shifts in conditions that would be illegal in any other era. He hired shave-tails, young, aggressive foremen who were told that their only job was to keep the muckers moving. If a man slowed down to wipe the sweat from his eyes, he was fired. If a man complained about the lack of water, he was replaced by one of the thousands of desperate souls waiting at the gates of Boulder City. This environment of absolute disposability led to shortcuts that nearly resulted in the total destruction of the project in February of 1932. The Colorado River is not a gentle stream. It is a violent, unpredictable beast. In early 1932, an unseasonable warm spell in the Rockies sent a massive wall of meltwater screaming down the canyon. The water level rose 40 feet in less than 24 hours. The diversion tunnels, massive as they were, couldn't handle the volume. The river began to overtop the temporary cofferdams that were protecting the main construction site. If those cofferdams failed, thousands of men working in the deep pit of the foundation would be drowned in seconds. The sirens wailed through the canyon. A sound that usually meant a blast was imminent, but this time it meant run. Men scrambled up the sheer rock walls, clawing at ropes and ladders as the brown, churning water roared over the top of the barriers. Equipment worth millions was swallowed in an instant. Trucks were tossed like toys. For a moment it looked like the river had won. But as soon as the water receded, even before the mud had settled, Frank Crowe was back on the rim, screaming for the men to get back down there. There was no safety inspection. There was no check for structural integrity of the canyon walls after the flood's erosion. Crowe refused to wait. He ordered the muckers back into the pit while the ground was still a liquid slurry of silt and debris. One worker, a rigger named Thomas Miller, hesitated. He pointed out that the rock face above them was weeping water and looked ready to slide. The foreman didn't even look up. He told Miller that if he didn't want the job, there were 500 men in the camp who did. Miller went back down. An hour later, a section of the canyon wall gave way, burying Miller and 3 other men under 20 tons of saturated earth. They didn't stop the work to find them. They simply brought in the steam shovels and kept digging. The bodies were eventually recovered, but the project didn't lose a single hour of productivity. That was the math of the Hoover Dam. 4 lives were worth less than 60 minutes of progress. This relentless drive for speed created a culture of engineered risk. The riggers, the men who moved the massive steel cables and buckets of concrete across the canyon, were working with equipment that was being stressed far beyond its design limits. The cableways were the arteries of the project, swinging 20-ton buckets of concrete over the heads of hundreds of workers below. The cables groaned under the weight, fraying and snapping with terrifying frequency. When a cable snapped, it didn't just break. It whipped through the air with enough force to cut a man in half. In June of 1932, a cable failure sent a bucket plummeting into a crew of workers on the Nevada side. The impact was so great it was felt in the offices of the 6 companies miles away. 6 men were pulverized instantly. The official report called it an unforeseeable mechanical failure. The workers knew better. They had been reporting the fraying cables for weeks. But replacing a cable meant shutting down the line for a day, and a day was worth $3,000 in penalties. To the 6 companies, it was cheaper to pay for 6 funerals, if they paid at all than to replace a cable. The engineering of the Hoover Dam is often cited as a triumph of human ingenuity, and in many ways it was. The cooling system, the diversion tunnels, the massive arch-gravity design, these were revolutionary concepts. But we must ask, who was the engineering for? The cooling pipes weren't installed to keep the workers from burning their hands on the hot concrete. They were installed to ensure the structure didn't crack. The diversion tunnels weren't built to provide a safe workspace. They were built to clear the way for the profit-generating dam. Every technical solution was designed to protect the investment, not the investor's laborers. The muckers, who spent their days knee-deep in the muck of the riverbed, were exposed to more than just physical danger. The very silt of the Colorado River was a cocktail of minerals and bacteria that caused canyon sores, infections that would eat through the skin and refuse to heal in the constant heat and moisture. There was no medical relief for this. The men would wrap their legs in gasoline-soaked rags to try and cauterize the wounds so they could keep working. If you couldn't stand, you couldn't earn. And if you couldn't earn, your family in the ragtag camps of Williamsville or McKeeversville would starve. The 6 companies also utilized a psychological engineering tactic. They promoted a culture of rugged individualism and pioneer spirit to mask the reality of their negligence. They made it a point of pride for a man to work through the heat, to ignore the tunnel sickness, and to laugh at the widowmakers. They turned survival into a competition. If you survived the day, you were a real man. If you died, you were just another pussy who couldn't hack the canyon. This toxic bravado served the bosses perfectly. It kept the men from organizing, kept them from demanding safety gear, and kept them focused on outperforming each other while the 6 companies collected the bonuses for finishing ahead of schedule. By late 1932, the dam was rising out of the floor of the Black Canyon like a gray, concrete mountain. It was a sight of awe-inspiring power, a testament to what could be achieved when the resources of a nation were focused on a single point. But the men looking up from the bottom of the pit didn't see a monument to progress. They saw a tombstone. They saw the place where their friends had been crushed, where their lungs had been scorched, and where their humanity had been stripped away for $4 a day. The river had been tamed, the heat had been managed by miles of ice-water pipes, and the engineering hurdles had been cleared one by one. But as the structure neared its peak, the human cost was no longer something that could be hidden behind the pneumonia lies of company doctors. The sheer number of accidental deaths was becoming a public relations problem that even the powerful 6 companies couldn't ignore. The families of the dead were starting to talk. The workers were starting to look at the massive wall of concrete and realize that they were building a monument to their own exploitation. The engineering was a success, but the moral foundation of the project was beginning to crumble. The builders had conquered the Colorado River, but they were about to find out that you can't bury the truth as easily as you can bury a mucker in a concrete pour. As completion neared, the true cost was becoming clear. The engineering was a success, but the moral foundation of the project was beginning to crumble. The builders had conquered the Colorado River, but they were about to find out that you can't bury the truth as easily as you can bury a mucker in a concrete pour. As completion neared, the true cost was becoming clear. While the world marveled at the sheer volume of concrete, a more sinister architecture was being constructed behind closed doors. This was a structure of silence, built from falsified medical records, suppressed protests, and the systematic erasure of entire communities. The 6 companies didn't just want to build a dam. They wanted to build a profit margin that wouldn't be dented by the pesky inconvenience of human life. To understand the depth of the deception, you have to look into the diversion tunnels. Deep in the bowels of the canyon walls, where the air was thick with the blue haze of truck exhaust and the temperature never dropped below 100 degrees, men were dying in a way that didn't involve falling rocks or heavy machinery. They were falling over mid-stride, gasping for air that wasn't there. Their faces turned a haunting shade of cherry red, a classic sign of carbon monoxide poisoning. But if you look at the official death certificates from 1931 and 1932, you won't find carbon monoxide listed as a cause of death. Instead, you see one word repeated over and over with chilling regularity: pneumonia. This wasn't a medical mistake. This was a calculated, corporate-mandated lie. Dr. Niles Slattery, the chief physician for 6 companies, was the architect of this fraud. He knew that if a worker died of carbon monoxide poisoning, the company was legally liable for an industrial accident. They would have to pay out insurance claims to grieving widows and fatherless children. But if a man died of pneumonia, it was classified as a natural death, an act of God. In the eyes of the law, the company owed the family nothing. Slattery and the executives of 6 companies understood the math of misery. They realized it was cheaper to bury a man and lie to his wife than it was to install proper ventilation in the tunnels. Take the case of a worker whose lungs were seared by the heat and filled with the invisible poison of internal combustion. He would go to the company hospital, shivering despite the desert heat, his body failing. When he died, the diagnosis was preordained. Between 1931 and 1932, at least 42 workers were officially listed as dying from pneumonia. In reality, investigators and labor advocates estimated the number of gas-related deaths was significantly higher, but the evidence was being scrubbed in real time. The company even went so far as to claim the desert air was the culprit, rather than the hundreds of trucks idling in unventilated stone tubes. This wasn't just neglect, it was a conspiracy to defraud the dead. The workers weren't blind to what was happening. They saw their friends being hauled out of the tunnels, limp and red-faced. They saw the lukewarm, silt-heavy water they were expected to drink while the bosses sat in air-cooled offices. By August of 1931, the tension had reached a breaking point. The heat in the canyon had hit 120 degrees. The men were living in Ragtown, a squalid collection of tents and shacks where the ground was so hot it would blister bare feet. They were being paid in scrip, usable only at company stores that inflated prices to claw back every cent of their meager wages. They demanded a raise, better water, and real safety measures in the tunnels. They demanded to be treated like human beings. The response from 6 companies and the federal government was swift and brutal. Secretary of the Interior Ray Lyman Wilbur, a man who prioritized the project's schedule over the lives of the men building it, had no intention of allowing a strike to delay his monument to progress. He saw the workers not as citizens, but as obstacles. When the men walked off the job, 6 companies didn't negotiate. They moved to crush them. Federal marshals were brought in, and the workers were given an ultimatum: get back to work or get out of the canyon. On August 14, 1931, the eviction began at gunpoint. Families who had nothing but a few blankets and some tin cooking pots were forced out of their tents. The company shut off the water to the camps in the middle of a record-breaking heat wave. Men, women, and children were herded like cattle out of the construction zone and into the unforgiving open desert. The message was clear: if you won't die quietly for the dam, you can die loudly in the sand. The strike was broken in less than a week. The men who returned were forced to sign yellow dog contracts, promising never to join a union. The collusion between Ray Lyman Wilbur and the 6 companies was total. They had bypassed labor laws, ignored safety regulations, and used federal force to ensure that the flow of profit remained as steady as the flow of the river they were trying to choke. But the workers weren't the only ones being sacrificed. As the dam grew, a massive lake began to form behind it, Lake Mead, and as the water rose, it began to swallow history. For over 70 years, the town of St. Thomas had thrived in the Mopa Valley. Founded in 1865 by Mormon settlers, it was a community of 300 people who had carved a life out of the desert. They had built a school, a post office, a grocery store, and dozens of homes. It was a place where children played under the shade of massive cottonwood trees. But to the engineers in Washington, St. Thomas was nothing more than a coordinate on a map that needed to be submerged. The federal government didn't ask the people of St. Thomas if they wanted to leave. They told them they had to. The residents were offered a pittance for their land, far less than what it was worth. They watched as the government sent in crews to strip the town. Trees that had been planted by grandfathers were cut down. Graves were exhumed and moved to higher ground, though many were left behind to be claimed by the silt. The last resident of St. Thomas, a man named Hugh Lord stayed until the very last second. In June of 1938, he woke up to find the water lapping at his front door. He rowed away in a boat, looking back as his home disappeared beneath the surface. A whole community, a whole way of life, was erased to provide electricity for the bright lights of Los Angeles and Las Vegas. Even more invisible in the official narrative was the dispossession of the Southern Paiute. For centuries, the Southern Paiute people had lived along the banks of the Colorado. The river was their lifeblood, their sacred ancestor, and their primary source of sustenance. They didn't have deeds recorded in a courthouse in Las Vegas, but their connection to the land was older than the United States itself. When the dam project began, the Paiute were never consulted. Their ancestral lands, their sacred sites, and their traditional foraging grounds were simply seized. There were no newsreels filmed of their displacement. There were no government checks sent to compensate them for the loss of their heritage. They were simply pushed further into the margins of the desert, their history drowned under hundreds of feet of water, their presence ignored by the men in suits who spoke of reclaiming the wilderness. To reclaim something implies it was once yours. The Bureau of Reclamation was taking land that had never belonged to them. The devastation didn't stop at the dam site. It flowed downstream, or rather it stopped flowing. Before the dam, the Colorado River Delta was one of the most vibrant ecosystems on the planet. It was a massive green expanse of 2 million acres where the river met the Sea of Cortez. It was a haven for hundreds of species of birds, fish, and mammals. This was the home of the Kakapa tribe, the people of the river. For more than 1,000 years, they had lived in harmony with the river's natural cycles. They farmed the rich silt left behind by the annual floods and fished the teeming waters of the delta. When the Hoover Dam's gates closed, the pulse of the river stopped. The annual floods that rejuvenated the soil were gone. The fresh water that kept the salt at bay was diverted to the thirsty Imperial Valley and the growing suburbs of the Southwest. The delta began to wither. The lush lagoons dried up, replaced by cracked, salt-encrusted earth. The Kakapa watched as their world died in slow motion. The fish they relied on, like the massive totoaba which can grow to 6 feet long, began to disappear. The totoaba once migrated in the millions to spawn in the brackish waters of the delta. Today, they are on the brink of extinction because the river no longer reaches the sea. The Kakapa were stripped of their economy, their food security, and their cultural identity. Also that a desert city 300 miles away could have green lawns and neon signs. The environmental cost of the Hoover Dam is a debt that is still being paid today. By stopping the flow of sediment, the dam effectively began to starve the Grand Canyon downstream. The beaches and sandbars that provided habitat for native fish were washed away and never replaced. The temperature of the water changed from a warm, silty brown to a cold, clear green, killing off native species like the humpback chub that had evolved over millions of years to survive in the river's natural state. We didn't just build a wall of concrete. We severed an artery of the continent. We traded an entire ecosystem for a battery that would eventually run low. But in the 1930s, none of this was allowed to surface in the public consciousness. The Bureau of Reclamation and the 6 companies ran a masterclass in public relations. They invited journalists to see the miracle in the desert, but they kept them away from the pneumonia wards. They showed off the massive generators, but they didn't show the empty, flooded streets of St. Thomas. They spoke of harnessing the river, but they never mentioned the Kakapa families who were now starving because the river had been stolen from them. The collusion between Ray Lyman Wilbur and the 6 companies was the glue that held this facade together. Wilbur protected the contractors from federal investigation. When reports of the brutal conditions in the tunnels reached Washington, they were buried in committees. When labor organizers tried to document the true death toll, they were branded as radicals and agitators. The government and the corporation had become a single entity with a single goal: finish the project at any cost, and make sure the public believes the cost was only measured in dollars. They succeeded in the short term. The American public, desperate for a win during the Great Depression, bought the story. They saw the Hoover Dam as a symbol of American resilience, a triumph of man over nature. They didn't see the cherry-red faces of the men dying in the tunnels. They didn't see the Southern Paiute elders weeping for their drowned ancestors. They didn't see the salt flats where a lush delta used to be. The narrative was controlled, the descent was crushed, and the bodies were accounted for only when it was impossible to hide them. By the time the last bucket of concrete was poured in 1935, the dam stood as a staggering achievement of engineering and a terrifying monument to human exploitation. The The 6 companies walked away with millions in profit, their reputations bolstered by a project they had built on a foundation of lies. Dr. Slattery's pneumonia diagnosis had saved them a fortune. The federal government had its showpiece, but for the families of the 112 officially dead, and the hundreds more whose deaths were scrubbed from the record, there was no celebration. There was only the cold, hard reality that their loved ones had been traded for a piece of infrastructure. The structure opened to celebration. Nobody mentioned the bodies buried in the foundation. The politicians gave speeches about the future, about a desert that would bloom, and about a river that had finally been tamed. They spoke of the thousands of jobs created, but they were silent about the thousands of lives displaced. As the dignitaries cut the ribbons and the first turbines began to hum, the water of Lake Mead continued to rise, slowly covering the last remnants of St. Thomas, the last sacred Paiute sites, and the truth of what it actually took to build the greatest dam in the world. The engineering was a masterpiece, but the human cost was an indictment that would take decades to fully surface. The builders had conquered the river, but in doing so, they had created a legacy of displacement and deception that would haunt the American West for generations to come. Next time you look at the blue expanse of Lake Mead, remember that it is a graveyard. It is a graveyard for a town, for a culture, and for the men who were told their lives were less valuable than a bag of cement. The water is deep, and it is cold, and beneath it lies the evidence of a crime disguised as progress. The Hoover Dam was sold as a gift to the American people, but it was paid for with the blood of workers who were denied the right to breathe and the heritage of people who were denied the right to exist. The lights of Las Vegas may be bright, but they are powered by a darkness that most people choose to ignore. As the 1930s drew to a close, the Hoover Dam was no longer just a construction site. It was a functioning heart for the Southwest. But even as the water powered the growth of empires, the cracks in the story were starting to show. The families of the pneumonia victims didn't forget. The Kakapa didn't forget. And the river itself, now a ghost of its former self, began to show the world what happens when you try to kill a force of nature. The dam was finished, but the story of the cost was only just beginning to be told. The true legacy of the Hoover Dam isn't the concrete. It's the silence that was required to build it. And that silence was about to be challenged by the very people the project tried to erase. Next time you see the massive curve of the dam, think of the men like Edward Arner, who died in the heat of a tunnel and was told his death was his own fault. Think of the children of St. Thomas who watched their schools disappear under the waves. Think of the Delta, now a wasteland, where the river used to sing. The cost of progress is never just a number in a budget. It is the sum total of every life broken and every memory drowned. The structure opened to celebration. Nobody mentioned the bodies buried in the foundation. September 30th, 1935. The Nevada sun beat down with a relentless, punishing glare, reflecting off the massive, curved face of the concrete monolith. Thousands of people had gathered, their cars kicking up dust for miles across the desert floor. They had come to witness the birth of a new era. On a temporary wooden stage draped in red, white, and blue bunting, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt looked out over the Black Canyon. He saw a canyon that had been tamed, a river that had been shackled, and a desert that was about to be forcibly turned green. When he stepped to the microphone, his voice boomed with the confidence of a nation that believed it had finally conquered nature itself. He spoke of industrial genius. He spoke of the triumph of the American spirit. He called the dam a victory of the mind of man over the forces of the wild. But as the applause echoed off the canyon walls, there was a deafening silence where the names of the dead should have been. Roosevelt did not mention the 112 men who had been sacrificed to make that moment possible. He did not mention the families in ragtag tent cities who were still mourning fathers and sons. He did not mention the men who had gasped their last breaths in the suffocating heat of the diversion tunnels, their lungs filled with carbon monoxide and dust, only to have their deaths recorded as natural causes. The ceremony was a masterclass in erasure. The blood was washed away by the sheer scale of the achievement, leaving only the gleaming, white concrete and the political glory. The tragedy of the Hoover Dam is not just found in the moments of sudden violence, the falling rocks or the snapped cables, but in the way those deaths were leveraged into global power. The men who died were the fuel for a corporate engine that is still running today. The 6 companies, the consortium that won the bid for the dam, didn't just walk away with a finished project. They walked away with a blueprint for how to dominate the world. The profits from the Hoover Dam, built on the backs of men paid pennies an hour while they risked their lives in 120-degree heat, launched the global empires of Bechtel and Kaiser. Before the dam, these were significant but relatively regional players. After the dam, they became the architects of the modern world. They used the capital and the reputation gained from Black Canyon to build the military-industrial complex. They built the ships for World War II, the refineries in the Middle East, and the nuclear plants that dot our landscape. Every skyscraper and every pipeline they have touched since 1935 carries a trace of the blood spilled in Nevada. They learned that if you build something big enough, the public will forgive any number of graves. They learned that the government would protect the contractor over the worker every single time. This was the birth of the too-big-to-fail infrastructure model, where the human cost is treated as a secondary line item, easily redacted or renamed. Today, the monument to that industrial genius is showing its age in a way that feels like a slow-motion reckoning. If you stand on the edge of the dam today and look out over Lake Mead, you don't see a triumphant reservoir. You see the white ring. It is a ghostly, mineral-stained bathtub ring that marks where the water used to be, hundreds of feet above the current surface. The American West was built on a lie of infinite water, a lie that the Hoover Dam was supposed to make true. But the river is drying up. The climate is changing, and the hubris of 1935 is meeting the reality of the 21st century. We are approaching what engineers call dead pool. This is the point where the water level drops so low that it can no longer reach the intake towers. When that happens, the turbines will stop spinning. The electricity that sustains the bright lights of Las Vegas and the sprawling suburbs of Phoenix will simply vanish. The dam will become a useless, billion-ton tombstone in the desert. We sacrificed 112 men to build a system that was never designed for a world that isn't growing wetter. We traded lives for a temporary fix, and now the fix is failing. The industrial genius Roosevelt praised didn't account for the long-term cost of altering an entire continent's ecosystem. The tactics used to hide the Hoover Dam's body count are not relics of the past. They are being used right now across the globe. When we look at the construction of the stadiums for the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, the parallels are chilling. Thousands of migrant workers from Nepal, India, and Bangladesh died in the blistering heat of the Middle East, building monuments to sport and national pride. When the bodies were sent home, the official cause of death was almost always the same: natural causes, heart failure, or respiratory collapse. It is the exact same narrative the six companies used when they claimed their workers were dying of pneumonia, rather than the carbon monoxide poisoning and heat stroke caused by the contractors' refusal to provide proper ventilation. The authorities in Qatar, much like the Bureau of Reclamation in the 1930s, looked the other way because the project was too important to be slowed down by safety regulations or human rights. We see the same pattern in the rush for rare earth minerals in the Congo and the construction of massive infrastructure projects in developing nations under the Belt and Road Initiative. The script never changes. The project is framed as progress for the many, while the few who die building it are treated as an inevitable, if regrettable, statistic. We are still building our modern world on a foundation of hidden graves. Closer to home, the neglect of the infrastructure we already have reveals an even darker truth. We were willing to kill men to build the Hoover Dam, but we are unwilling to invest in the safety of the people who use it today. Consider the Brent Spence Bridge, a vital artery between Ohio and Kentucky. It was designed to carry 80,000 vehicles a day, but it now groans under the weight of 160,000. It is functionally obsolete and structurally deficient. It has seen fiery crashes and constant closures, yet for decades, the political will to fix it has been absent. We have a culture that prizes the ribbon-cutting ceremony of the new, but ignores the crumbling reality of the old. We value the economic speed of the project over the lives of those who maintain it. The rush for progress that killed workers in the 1930s has morphed into a rush for efficiency that endangers us all today. We are still operating under the same cold logic. How much risk can we tolerate before it affects the bottom line? How many lives is a day of saved commute time worth? We must look back at the Tierney family to understand the true weight of this history. J.G. Tierney was the first man to die on the project, drowning in the Colorado River while conducting a survey in 1922. Exactly 13 years later, to the day, his son Patrick Tierney became the last man to die, falling from one of the intake towers just before the project was completed. 13 years. 2 generations of one family swallowed by the same project. The Tierneys are the bookends of the Hoover Dam's human cost. Their story isn't about industrial genius or the triumph of engineering. It's about a family that was hollowed out so that we could have air conditioning in the desert. When you see the Art Deco statues and the polished brass of the dam's interior, you are looking at a shroud. The beauty of the architecture is designed to make you forget the brutality of the labor. It is designed to make the 112 deaths feel like a small price to pay for the miracle of the American West. But for the families of the men who were buried in the heat, there was no miracle. There was only a void. The total cost of the Hoover Dam cannot be measured in the $49 million it cost to build in 1931. It must be measured in the 112 lives officially recorded and the hundreds more who died later from the damage done to their lungs and hearts in the tunnels. It must be measured in the indigenous communities whose lands were flooded and whose sacred river was turned into a plumbing system. It must be measured in the ecosystems destroyed and the species driven to extinction. We are the beneficiaries of a crime we refuse to acknowledge. Every time a light switch is flipped in Los Angeles, every time a sprinkler head pops up in a Nevada golf course, we are drawing on the legacy of those 112 men. We are using the life force of the workers who were told their lives were less important than the schedule of a concrete pour. We have a debt to the dead that can only be paid by telling the truth about how our world was actually made. Next time you stand on that massive concrete wall and feel the wind whipping through the canyon, don't just look at the water. Look at the ground beneath your feet. Remember that the smooth surface hides a jagged history. Remember that the men who built this were not industrial geniuses in suits. They were desperate men in high-scale boots and hard hats who were pushed to the brink of human endurance. Remember George Hamrick, who was crushed by a truck. Remember the men whose names were never carved into the bronze plaques because their deaths were too inconvenient for the official record. Remember that the electricity humming through the wires is a vibration of sacrifice. We must stop pretending that progress is a victimless process. We must start demanding that the names of the workers be held in higher regard than the names of the politicians who take the credit. Next time you use the electricity and water of the American West, remember the workers who paid with their lives. If you want to know the cost of progress, hit subscribe. I'll show you what they built and who they buried.